All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, my name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar, and thanks for joining me today for the role of policies in securing CUI, the best practices for CMMC compliance. So during today's session, we're going to cover how to use and how to utilize Exostar's Policy Pro application to really create and keep updated the policies you may have around the different controls for NIST 800-171. As part of that, you may want to utilize Policy Pro's free trial to see if it's a good fit for you. That does, as you see, have a free trial you can get from Exostar's website. So you can either use the URL here or go to Exostar's website, look for the product Policy Pro, and you'll see a button there to go ahead and start that free trial. Before we dive into the webinar itself, just want to cover a few housekeeping details. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. It does include Q&A. Now, you're going to be muted during today's presentation, but you can type me questions into the chat or into the question and answer section. I'll answer those questions while David is talking, my partner today. And I'll also try to get to those at the end as well. Now, a number of folks did submit questions when they submitted their registration to today's webinar. I do have those on a final slide. I believe there's 5 of them, and I'll answer those at the end of today's session as well. Now, if for some reason we do have an outage, just wait for a minute and try to reconnect. You can either just refresh your screen, or you can utilize that link that you receive via email to connect in today's session, and that should bring you back into the webinar as well. Now, at any time, if you'd like to speak with one of our CMMC experts, or if you have any additional questions about Exostar or our products, you can reach us a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. You can also come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a chat feature there as well as a form to submit questions on each of those web pages. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into today's session. So as I mentioned, I'm being joined today by David Rowe of our partner ISMS Solutions. David, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is David Rowe. I'm the Business Development Manager here at ISMS, and I'll be walking you through the platform today.
Thanks, David. So before I turn it over to David, I want to give everyone kind of an update of where we are in the CMMC rulemaking process, and just to give a quick overview of the Policy Pro application as well. So just to kind of let everyone know where we are in the current rulemaking process. And we have had a step forward this week. So hopefully, as many of you may know, the formal rule around CMMC, 32 CFR, and CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations, went into effect on 12/16 of 2024. This is the rule that allowed the CMMC program to really kick off. It authorized organizations to be able to reach out to those C3PA organizations, start to schedule assessments, and really start to move forward in that process. Now, with that said, the rule we're waiting for is the rule which will actually put CMMC into government contracts itself. That's the 48 CFR. Now, the movement that we have had in the overall program is that 48 CFR has moved over to the Office of Management and Budget as kind of that final rulemaking phase. It takes 60, 90 days to get through that process. And then that rule will be published. And then I think it's 60 days after that, there's a possibility that you'll start to see CMMC appear in DoD contracts. So that's kind of the last phase before the formal program kicks in. Just a reminder about the major difference of CMMC and what we have today is that with CMMC, rather than just self-assessments and self-attestation of how you're doing against NIST 800-171 when you receive controlled unclassified information, we're going to move to a program that requires a third-party assessment of how you've undertaken to enforce those individual controls. It also defines some additional classifications of service providers. One of those is a cloud service provider. So if you're utilizing a cloud service provider to fulfill some of the requirements of NIST 800-171, that cloud service provider should be a FedRAMP moderate or a FedRAMP moderate equivalent application. If you're utilizing an external service provider, these are services organizations that provide functions as possibly as outsourced IT arms you have. They might be fulfilling a portion of your security requirements around safeguarding of information. Those external service providers are kind of encompassed within your overall system security plan. So their policies and procedures need to be accounted for and fulfill the NIST 800-171 requirements around those different controls that they may be managing or securing on behalf of your organization. Now, just to level set everybody again, CMMC has 3 levels. And the majority of organizations in the defense industrial base will fall under level 1. Level 1 is pretty straightforward. There are 15 requirements that you annually self-assess and that you annually affirm that your organization does these things. You only receive what's called FCI, Federal Contract Information. You need to safeguard that information in accordance with those 15 requirements. Now, level 2 is when we start to see this new requirement of third-party assessment organizations checking on your compliance with NIST 800-171. And NIST 800-171 is simply the National Institute of Standards requirements around safeguarding of controlled unclassified information in non-governmental systems. So this is all for contractors and subcontractors who may receive CUI and how you must protect that information. NIST 800-171 has 110 individual controls grouped into 14 control families. You need to implement those controls, have evidence that you do those things, and once every 3 years, you have a third-party assessment organization validate and verify that you do those things. Now, level 2 does have a small portion of organizations or contracts underneath it, which will allow a self-assessment, but that's going to be a per contract choice of the contracting officer. It's not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to request a waiver. You're not going to be able to, ask that, this contract be let under self-assessment. It's going to be, kind of set at the contracting office, and the contracting officer will determine that. Less than 2% of organizations will fall in this category. So it's expected that the majority of level 2 will require this third-party assessment. Level 3 is a higher level, right? There are additional requirements along with those 110 controls of NIST 800-171. There's 24 additional controls from NIST 800-172 that you've got to satisfy. You still will have a third-party assessment, but that third-party assessment will be done by DIBCAC. There are certain instances where you may not have a control fully in effect. In those cases, NIST 800-171 and the self-assessment guidelines will tell you what controls you're allowed to have what's called a POAM, a plan of action and milestone against. You've got 6 months from the time that they conducted your assessment, found that you weren't doing this thing, to close that. Now, when CMMC does get implemented, right, so after 48 CFR goes into effect, it's going to be phased in over time. This is a graphic I pulled straight from the DoD CMMC site. And so you'll expect this to be rolled out over 3 years. That initial phase, so that first 12-month period, it's expected that for level 1 and level 2, everything will still be a self-assessment, just as it is today, right? Today, you're required to do a self-assessment. That will continue. Phase 2 is when you'll start to see that level 2 certification be required. So because it's a year, right, and because there are a limited number of C3PAOs, you really need to ensure that you're getting to that point where you're ready to engage with that third-party assessment organization, and you are, ready to kind of take that step and have them come in and evaluate you, because you're going to have that, from now until the rule goes into effect, and then 12 months after that to get that assessment done. Phase 3 will be 2 years after. That's when you'll start to see those assessments for level 3 come into effect. And then phase 4 is when you'll see full implementation. Now, just keep in mind, right, DoD does reserve the right to advance phases of this based on the different contracts that they're requiring. So that just level set everybody on kind of where we are in the CMMC rulemaking process and what you need to get done when that takes effect. But, right, this shouldn't be much of a surprise because this has been coming for a long time. The requirements to safeguard CUI in accordance with NIST 800-171 have been in place for quite a number of years. And there are clauses in your contracts today, either with the Department of Defense or with your contracts because you're a subcontractor with those primes, where they've flowed down requirements to you based on those DFARS clauses, those Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. So if you've got those 7012 or 7019 clauses in a current contract, you should be familiar with NIST 800-171. Because you've got that 7012 clause, that said that you are required to safeguard controlled unclassified information in accordance with NIST 800-171. The 7019 clause requires that you do a self-assessment of how you're doing against each of those 110 controls. It asks you to score yourself, and it gives a scoring algorithm based on a point value of -5 to 1, 3, or 5 points for each control, or a -5, -3, -1 on each control. Evaluate how you're doing against each of those controls, score yourself, and you'll receive a score somewhere between a -203 and 110. And then take that score and enter it into the supplier performance risk system. This is a DoD system where you register as a supplier, you receive a cage code, and one of the tasks within there is that you input your score of how you're doing against NIST 800-171. Now, the DoD is the only ones who have access to this, but if you are doing business with many of the primes out there, they may be asking you today what that score is, what your plans are for CMMC compliance, et cetera, because it is, fully expected that this will be put in place, and you'll need to execute it within the next couple years. Now, when you start to look at NIST 800-171, the thing you're going to evaluate is a system. And that system is where you store, process, or transmit controlled unclassified information. So one of the good ways to try and figure out what that encompasses within your organization is to take a look and create a CUI data flow. This will let you illustrate, kind of how CUI comes into my organization, who in my organization may interact with that, who may, store, process, or transmit it. Where do we do that? What kinds of systems do we have in place that touch that? Do I have not only, say, my sales team members or my shop floor employees? Do I also have some IT folks that may be part of my backup or disaster recovery administration, which have rights to those files? How do I remove users? How do I add users to these systems? How do I determine who has rights to these systems? All these kinds of things will help you set that boundary and return and tell you what the boundary of your overall system is. Because at the end of the day, that C3PA organization, when you engage with them, is going to want to see your system security plan. You're going to define that as part of your obligation. And that's what the third-party assessment organization is going to assess when they start to do this. They're going to want to see that system security plan, all of the evidence that you have around how you implement these different controls, and your policies and procedures of how you actually do that. Now, those policies are those kind of macro things that you do around a particular control family. So, one of the control families is access management. What do you do to safeguard access management for controlled unclassified information? And then there's a number of different controls underneath that. And so how do I implement each of those controls to enforce my particular policy? And that's really where kind of diagramming that system, understanding each of the different people and assets that are part of that and what those things are. Now, that assessment guide, that NIST 800-171 Alpha, that is the assessment guide for NIST 800-171. That outlines the different kinds of things that make up your overall system, both the people, the processes, the different kinds of technology. Is this a thing where we actually store controlled unclassified information? Now, that may be an electronic system. It may be a physical system. It may be a file cabinet, right? It may be a file cabinet in a room. And what kind of physical controls do you have of who has access to that? All of those things make up part of that overall system and the overall system boundary that is going to be assessed when you engage with that third-party assessment organization. But what it's going to start with is building that system security plan. What do I do? How do I do it? Who's involved? What kind of policies do I have in place? And then what kind of implementation do I do around each of those different controls? When I start to build that system, not only do I need to understand that data flow and each of those different pieces, it would be helpful to you and that third-party assessment organization if you actually illustrate that, right? Provide a data flow diagram. Provide a network diagram that includes the boundary of these overall systems. So everyone knows you've accounted for these things. You understand your overall system and what you're protecting. Now, this really starts at that policy level. As I mentioned, what you want to do is to create those overarching policies around those different control families. What do we do to ensure access rights? What do we do around physical security and those kinds of things? And then work down to how do we implement these particular controls and what evidence do we have that we've actually done that? So what David's going to talk to you about next is creating those different policies, using Exostar's Policy Pro to take the templates that are available there, customize those to fit your organization because everybody's a little different. How do I make sure what I wrote actually makes sense and fits this particular kind of policy? And then ensure that I maintain and review that over time. Because part of every good CMMC program, because that's what this really is and how you need to manage it. This isn't just a once every 3-year activity. It's not just a once a year activity. This is an ongoing program that you're going to need to manage. And there'll be changes over time, right? NIST 800-171 does evolve. We're currently, well, actually, CMMC points to NIST 800-171 R2, revision 2, as what you need to apply in your overall CMMC program. However, there is a NIST 800-171 R3 that's been approved and is currently out there. That's going to come sooner or later, right? Sooner or later, DoD is going to make the switch from R2 to R3. Now, good thing is, right, with a SaaS application like Policy Pro, when those changes are made, the application will be updated as they are, including that AI engine that's used to evaluate the policies once you've written them. This policy engine can also be used if you've written policies that weren't necessarily for CMMC or NIST 800-171, but maybe you created a policy for ISO or some other compliance standard out there, and you want to see how that policy might map to a similar one in NIST 800-171. You can run those through the policy engine as well, get the feedback, and then determine what you may need to adjust to make this more compliant with NIST 800-171. So with that, let me turn this over to David to show you how this actually works.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so as Kevin mentioned, Policy Pro is designed to help you and your organization get compliant with the various requirements that you need to meet, including the NIST 800-171, which is part of those DFARS clauses that Kevin mentioned, as well as help you with your upcoming CMMC certifications. Again, the NIST 800-171 that's currently applicable to CMMC is that revision 2, so that's what you'll be working on in Policy Pro. Regardless of where your organization is in your cybersecurity journey, so whether you're just getting started out, maybe you don't have any of those policies and procedures and other documentation that's required for meeting the NIST requirements, or maybe your organization is further along and you already have all of your existing policies in place. Regardless of where you are in that process, the platform will be able to help assist you through that journey. We'll start off using our policy building tool, and this is really the first step you want to take, especially if you don't have those policies that align with the 110 controls. And in today's demo, we'll be walking through an example of CMMC 2.0 level 2, so the 14 different policy families and the 110 controls. The first time through on the platform, you'll receive this pop-up here, which briefly explains what policies are, as well as some of those other documents that Kevin mentioned. For example, the SSP, the System Security Plan, the POAMs, which is your Plan of Actions and Milestones, as well as your gap assessment and risk register. If you don't have those documents, we do have templates to those that you can download. They are pretty basic and bare bones, so if you need further assistance and guidance on it, there is a companion product that Kevin will talk about after this demo called Certification Assistant, which is part of the overall CMMC bundle. Moving on to the policies themselves, we'll start off with an access control policy here. And what you'll come to is this prepare, gather, and consult page. This is everything you're going to need to prepare prior to even getting started with the policies themselves. For example, it could include things like gathering your organization's documents, records, and other materials related to these various access control topics. Additionally, who you may want to consult with, whether they are internal or external stakeholders. For example, it could include people like your network administrator, head of IT, or CISO, and then any sort of outside contractor if you do utilize them. So they could include your MSPs, your MSSPs, your IT consultants, basically anyone who might be involved or part of that part of your network that touches CUI. Moving on to the policy template itself, all of our policy templates are broken out into a couple different sections. We've got the header here, which includes your organization name, the department or departments this policy falls under, the issue date for when you finalize the document, approved by, and the tracking number. The tracking number can be used in a number of ways. However, most people use it to keep track of the version number of the policy. So as you work on revisions and updates, just like Kevin mentioned, this is a continuous process. So as you review your documentation, as things change, whether it's within your organization, whether it's a particular policy or process that's changing, or it's the standard itself that's updating. Regardless, you want to make sure that these policies are periodically being reviewed and updated. The other sections include the purpose, the scope, and the individual practices. So this is where the bulk of your work is going to be done. And again, you want to make sure that you're going into this policy template and updating it to fit what it is your organization is actually doing. There's a couple key pieces of information here on this page, including the guidelines, which can be found right underneath the practice description. And the guidelines will help you understand exactly what sort of information is included in that practice section, as well as kind of in plain English, break that section into more digestible, understandable information. To open up the practice template, you'll click on the pencil icon here located on the right-hand corner, and that's going to bring up the policy template for 3.1.1. So we can see that this policy template is going to be about our organization's account creation, work from home, and bring your own device policy. A couple notes as you're working through these policy documents. One, you want to make sure that you're reading through the entirety of this template. What's written here should reflect what your organization has implemented or what your organization plans to implement in the future based off your policies. Additionally, as I mentioned, there are certain sections you want to pay particular attention to in order to customize it to meet exactly what it is you're doing. An example of that is in the first paragraph where it talks about all account creations will be submitted by the requesting department manager to the IT support email address for completion using the account request ticketing system or other process. So there, um, if you are utilizing a ticketing system, you'll fill in whatever system that is that your organization has chosen. Otherwise, if you're not utilizing a ticketing system, then whatever other process it is your organization is using to handle those account creation requests in a manner that makes most sense to your organization. We have made a couple of updates to the policy builder templates as well, including the ability to add comments and mentions. So you can add other users, whether they're internal or external, for example, an MSP. You can add your MSP and collaborate on these policy templates together as well. Once you've made any changes you wish to make, you're going to save those changes, and that's going to timestamp it as well as who the user was that last made that change. Additionally, it'll also save it into the version history. So if you select that version history button, you'll see any previous versions and any of those changes that you made. You can go back to a previous version, but what's great about the version history is that it shows the periodic reviewing and updating of your documentation. So if you need that evidence to show an auditor that you are periodically reviewing your policies, you can use version history to do that. Once you've made all those changes, we're not going to go through every practice here together, but once you've done that and gone in and actually customized it, you'll then click on this export button, and that's going to do a couple things. It's going to combine all of the sections I mentioned previously, so the header, the purpose, the scope, and the individual practices into a single access control policy that will then be saved to your local drive. And it's also important prior to the next feature of the platform, which is going to be policy assessment. Policy assessment is that AI component of the platform. This is going to analyze and assess your documentation. And regardless of whether your organization is utilizing a policy created using our policy builder, or maybe you already have existing documents, and even if the documentation isn't specifically created for CMMC or for NIST, for example, maybe you did create cybersecurity documents for ISO 27001, you can upload those and see exactly what you have currently, what's missing, and what you still need to do in order to meet the requirements for CMMC. Additionally, even if you don't have, let's say, an access control policy specifically for CMMC, but you have, let's say, you have a password policy or a list of people who are allowed to have access to your networks, various other relevant documentation for access control. You can go ahead and upload multiple documents here as well in order to analyze and assess it. So for example, here I've uploaded an acceptable use policy and an account creation policy, and I can see exactly what's missing there. Once you've uploaded it, you're going to click on this detailed scorecard to view missing key phrases, and we assess your documents both at a high level as well as a granular level. At the high level, the overall assessment for this document appears relevant in size, scope, and organizational customization. The overall assessment is comprised of three different metrics: the relevance, the model similarity, and the word count. The relevance is how many key terms or phrases are included in your policy. The higher that is, the higher the relevance and therefore overall assessment will be. The model similarity compares the policy you've uploaded to our model documents, and we do that for two reasons. One, to ensure it's been appropriately customized to fit your organization's actual implementations, as well as ensuring that it's covering everything it needs to cover. Finally, the word count is simply to ensure it's long enough to accurately assess your document. So if you see that word count as too short, chances are the overall assessment and overall score might not necessarily be an accurate reflection of how your documentation is doing. In terms of the overall score, here you can see it's 70.3% for this document that I've uploaded. And our overall scoring is not like an academic score, meaning 90% as an A, 80% as a B. Our overall scoring is a relevance scoring system, meaning anything above a 50% shows a relevant document. But I'll talk a little bit further on in the demo about how you can utilize the overall score along with the other metrics to gauge how your policies are doing currently, as well as how they're doing over time. So that's everything at the high level. But we also provide some granular feedback in terms of exactly what it is you're missing in your document and how you can address those gaps that exist in your documentation. And we do that through our key elements not included, or Kenny for short. And we have two different types of Kennys, the control Kennys as well as general policy Kennys. My first example of a control Kenny is CUI, non-public information. That is that key term or phrase that's missing in my document that I should be looking to incorporate. And we can see some additional information posted underneath, which is the exact practice that it's associated with. In this case, it's 3.1.22. And to make it a little bit simpler to use and understand, we also provide the discussion requirements, which comes directly from the standard itself. So directly from NIST 800-171. And so you don't have to flip back and forth between the platform and the standard to see exactly what 3.1.22 is discussing. The documents for examination are going to be other sorts of documents, records, or materials that your organization might have that can help you address that control, Kenny, as you're working on incorporating it into your policies. So some examples of that might be system audit logs, procedures, addressing publicly accessible content, basically any relevant documentation. Additionally, once you've actually added it to your policies and implemented it in your organization, these documents for examination are also can also be used as evidence or artifacts that you have gone and implemented those things in your organization. So a big part of an audit is being able to actually prove that the things that are written in your policies are actually being implemented throughout your organization. And so you're going to need evidence to prove those various activities. The general policy Kenny terms are very similar in the sense that they're also key terms and phrases that are missing in my document. However, you'll notice there's no collapse all, expand all button with the additional information. And the reason for that is these general policy terms are not tied to a specific control like the ones above. They're more generic to the policy domain, in this case, an access control policy. So after you've incorporated all of those Kennys into your documentation, or at any point during, you can also export these results into a PDF. So if you want to save them to your local drive or share it with others who aren't on the platform, you can do that as well. One last feature I want to talk about here in policy assessment is this management approval feature. So I'll go ahead and click management approved on this policy, and we can discuss it further in the dashboard. The dashboard is where you'll come to see all your progress and work throughout the platform, whether you're creating policies in Policy Builder or assessing policies in Policy Assessment. All of that work is going to be shown here in the dashboard. Additionally, here in the green check mark with the management approved, this is my most recently management approved policy, so that everyone in the organization is following the most up-to-date policies. It's also a requirement of both NIST as well as CMMC that whoever's in charge of your CMMC program signs off on your policies and is ultimately responsible for your CMMC program. So one way to keep track of that activity and make sure it's being done is to use something like management approval. It also can show, again, that evidence that you are periodically reviewing and updating your documentation. It'll keep track of all your previous versions of your policies as well. So as you start incorporating those Kennys into your documentation, you'll notice that as you incorporate the Kenny numbers will obviously be going down, but your overall score will start to trend upwards. Use it simply to gauge how your policies are improving over time and that it's above a 50%. If it's below a 50%, likely you have a lot of Kennys, which means a lot of things missing, a lot of gaps within your documentation, and so it's not going to be a relevant document for CMMC, and you likely need to incorporate a lot of things that are missing within those policies. And that might occur especially if you're uploading not very relevant documentation or documentation that were kind of created for other cybersecurity purposes, and not specifically for protecting CUI. So hopefully this has been a helpful overview. If you do have additional resources that you need to do, whether it's while you're creating policies or while you're revising policies based off your policy assessment, you can always come to the reference library, which contains various resources and links across the web, mostly directly from the NIST Institute, but it's a quicker and more accurate way to get the information that you need in order to build out effective policies. There are a couple more things that Kevin's going to be walking through, but hopefully this has been a helpful demonstration about how to utilize Policy Pro in order to aid your efforts in building out those policies.
Thanks, David. All right, everybody. So Policy Pro is part of Exostar's CMMC Ready suite. It includes 2 additional applications that can help you obviously meet the CMMC requirements around NIST 800-171. Certification Assistant is an application that helps you manage that overall CMMC program. It is an application where you go through and you do a self-assessment. It allows you to centralize that information that you create around building that system, creating that system boundary, allows you to assess how you're doing against each of the controls, determines or basically what you do in it is you go into each control, you put in your implementation statement, the evidence that you've actually that you're actually doing those things, allows you to put in those different parties that might be responsible for either the overall system or particular control areas, and so it creates that overall record of how you're doing. It will keep track of that score that you need to enter into the SPRS system as you go through that self-assessment. If you don't have a control implemented, you can create that POAM against that control and manage that POAM to closure. When you're ready, you can mark that as implemented, obviously improve your score. I strongly suggest at that time you then go back into the SPRS system and update your score there as well. The other application is our managed Microsoft 365. This is an enclave up in Microsoft's Azure GCC High built on a Teams environment with an Exostar application embedded within it. That with that and utilizing this enclave will flow down to you 85 of those 110 NIST 800-171 controls that are fully managed by Exostar within the enclave. The other 25 controls are shared, and then it basically helps you jumpstart your completion of those NIST 800-171 requirements. Exostar also has a number of partners who can help you with kind of wherever you are in your CMMC journey, different kinds of assessments, everything from just a gap assessment, how are you doing, where, what are your, what gaps do you need to fill today, to a mock assessment. You may want somebody to come in and give you a look over your shoulder before you engage with that third-party assessment organization. We have partners with very programmed services engagements around CMMC that take you through the entire journey. These folks often use Exostar applications to deliver these services. And so kind of wherever you are in that CMMC journey, we can kind of help you out along that way. As I mentioned, I did get some questions prior to today's webinar. It's these 5. So let me answer these before I close off today's session. So number 1, should policies be specific and detailed, or should they be general? Should they be written to the level of the IT staff, or who should the policies be written such that all employees will understand them? So the policies themselves should be fairly general. Policies kind of are addressed at the control family level. The individual controls are typically handled by implementation statements. It's how do we do this thing? The policy handles that overall overarching kind of, this is our policy around about what we want to ensure is done. Then this is how we do each of these individual things. Now, those individual implementation statements are typically what's kind of written at that staff level, or what the individuals in the organization should understand. Now, it's important that your team members are actually trained on those things, because those third-party assessment organizations, they're going to look for a few things, right? They're going to look for your policies and your implementation statements. They're going to look for and ask for the evidence that you've actually done those things. And they may actually even ask for a practical exercise from one of your employees. Say, one of your actions is we join users, or we utilize Microsoft Entra groups to govern access to different information. They may ask somebody in your IT staff to say, okay, well, show us what happens when a new employee is onboarded and how you provision them to particular access rights. And so, your one of your folks may be asked to, well, take this employee, enter them into the right Entra group, et cetera. So they're going to want those things. Number 2. So we sell data destruction security of all levels, and we are constantly asked about if we have registered, even though I'm not sure what we need to register. Now, I'm not quite sure either, to tell you the truth. There are a number of things that you may register for. With CMMC, you would want to ensure that if you are a contractor or a subcontractor, that you are registered in the appropriate SPURS system, that you get a third-party assessment, and that they complete your assessment, and when they do that they enter that you've passed into the EMAS system. If you are a provider, like an external service provider, you may want to register as RPO, a registered practitioning organization, with the Cyber AB. So there are a number of different certifications and places. I would ask whoever tells you need to register or are you registered, what kind of registration are you asking for? And do you know where I take care of that? Wish I could be more specific, but I just, with the information given, that's the best I can do. So number 3, does it make sense to self-assess at level 2 while an organization waits to be assessed by a C3PAO? I would absolutely would suggest that you do a self-assessment while you're waiting for that C3PAO. Really for 2 reasons. Because 1, you don't want any surprises when that C3PAO shows up. Doing that self-assessment and ensuring that you do a detailed self-assessment will ensure that you're ready for that C3PAO. As part of their engagement with you, they're going to ask you for your evidence. They're going to ask for a package, and that package is going to include your system security plan, the evidence that you do these things. They're going to want to see that before they come on site. And so they understand what they're going to be evaluated when they're on site. So that kind of self-assessment will help you get ready for that. Number 4, is policy enough to enforce controls? We have a policy users sign off on stating they don't do certain things. That is the only enforcement in place. So policy itself is not enough to enforce controls. Most organizations, most assessments will ask that where possible, things should not be, if you will, done just by policy. If a technical control or an enforcement mechanism can be done, it should be done. For example, it's probably not enough to say that we restrict access only to authorized employees. And the way we enforce that is that we tell everybody that you shouldn't go to places you're not authorized for. They're going to want a technical control in place that enforces that kind of governance. one that says, look, only employees in these groups get access to this. Only people who request access and who their supervisors okay get access to this application or this storage area or things like that. So where a technical control can be put in place, it'll be expected to be in place, and there should be some kind of logging mechanism, et cetera, that those things are actually done. And obviously your folks should be trained on making sure that those policies are enforced. And then number 5, do machining designs or programs made in software like Mastercam and CAD software for an order containing CUI count as CUI itself? I wish I had a better answer, but this is going to be one of those where it depends. Because part of it's going to be, well, what is the output of that CAD software? Is it something itself, which most likely is CUI, right? So if the drawing itself is of a spec that was a written spec, the written spec was marked CUI, and then the rendition of that specification is most likely is also CUI. Now, the individual parts that make that up, each of those individual parts may not be, but again, it's going to depend. So I would almost always refer back to the contracting officer, asking them if they've provided the CUI markings and you're providing something back to them. I would probably mark that as CUI, but again, it's going to kind of depend on, can I relate this thing to this? Are the markings on here enough to identify this as that thing that was marked CUI? If it is, then it most likely is CUI itself as well. So everybody, as I close off today, as I mentioned, you will be receiving this slide deck today as a follow-up to today's presentation. Everybody who's registered will receive the presentation as well as a link to a recording of today's session. As part of that, you will receive this slide with some other links to additional information, including that free trial to Policy Pro, if you want to take a look at that and see if it makes sense for your organization. So with that, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention today. I hope everyone has a great day and a great rest of the week. Thanks so much for your time and attention, and have a great rest of the day.